Hello and welcome to you all today. I'm delighted and honored to introduce you to Professor Katharina Galor, the German-born Israeli historian and archaeologist, teaching at Brown's University, teaching at Brown's University in Rhode Island, in America, on the east coast of America. She teaches both at the Judaic Studies program as well as in the Center for Middle East Studies. Professor Galor is a scholar of visual and material culture whose work explores heritage, identity, and memory with a focus on Israel and Palestine. Trained in art history and archaeology in France and in Israel, she examines how images, objects, and built environments shape cultural and political narratives across history and religious traditions. Her books include Finding Jerusalem, Archaeology Between Science and Ideology, which was published in 2017, The Moral Triangle, Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians in 2020, in collaboration with, I believe, a Palestinian woman, man, and Jewish Women Between Conformity and Agency in 2024. Today, she's going to speak about her award-winning book, Out of Gaza, A Tale of Love, Exile, and Friendship, which was published last year, which is life writing at its best. It is a deeply moving narrative of two women spanning from Palestinian Gaza to Jordanian Amman, from America to France and Belgium, their intimate and unique friendship built on two tragedies, the Holocaust and the Nakba. It is the story of two women and their families caught in the cataclysmic upheavals of the 20th and 21st centuries, and yet it's the story of building bridges against the odds. Instead of telling you about the two women that we are going to hear about, I decided with Katie's permission to read to you her introduction to her book, because obviously not all of you or any of you will have the chance to get hold of the book, which is not that easily available. It is more in America, not so much here. Can you hear me well? This is Katharina speaking. I'm an Israeli. The woman I call Dima in this book is a Palestinian refugee. This is the story of our friendship, which began 4 years ago when I found Dima online and she became my Arabic teacher. In fact, it is more Dima's stories than mine, which isn't actually quite true. Dima's story of exile, of thwarted love, of her brave and obstacle-strewn quest for a place where she could live as she chose to be, with her husband, with the man she loved. Dima, in this sense, is a kind of example, a microcosm of the large plight of millions of other Palestinians who are victims, most obviously, of Israel's occupation of Palestinian land, but also at times of the armed Palestinian groups, Hamas in particular, that demand total obedience to their dictates and their ideology. It is a morally complicated story. It provides no easy political answer to the afflictions of the Middle East. But I hope it will humanize the Palestinian plight. But I hope my story will humanize the Palestinian plight and provide at least a little bit of hope that people on both sides of the conflict can find common ground, understanding, mutual sympathy, even love. And then she goes on to say, this Katharina say, no less than Dima's story, it is also my story that I had to tell. I wanted the therapeutic value of putting it on paper, getting it out, of recounting how the Holocaust, the 20th century most tragic example of human cruelty, left its trace on my family and on me, and informed my own understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How, of all people, can Israelis treat other people the way they treat Palestinians? For me, The Holocaust is the shadow that hangs over the history of the State of Israel and its way over the history of Palestinians and the related tragedies of the Nakba and the Gaza wars, the repeated and incredible afflictions of the Palestinian people, along with a prolonged experience of exile, displacement, and statelessness. The histories of Israelis and Palestinians are intertwined, connected to each other by casualty and essence. My relationship with Dima has entangled our lives in a private and very personal way, but it has also opened the much larger story of Israelis and Palestinians who, despite their bitter conflicts and claims of uniqueness and separate identities, are themselves mutually entangled, morally and practically. As our friendship grew, Dima and I realized that our families' histories, which in many ways are typical of the histories of many Israeli and Palestinian families, are eerily similar as well tragically different. And that's the story of this book. So I thought Katharina talk about her. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I forgot to say that you will take question and answers after the talk.
It's a pleasure. So first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful and generous introduction, and also for inviting me. And also thank you to Dr. Ellery Watson for organizing today's event and making this conversation possible. Vera and I only met quite recently. At first, we assumed that our point of connection was our shared scholarly interest in lives and histories of Jewish women, also in art history. But as we began talking, we discovered many more unexpected overlaps between our own stories, historical, geographical, linguistic, and also personal. As life-writing scholars Sidonie Smith and Julia Watson have emphasized, life narratives are rarely solitary. They emerge through encounters, through conversations, archives, and fragments of memory. And this understanding of narrative is central to the book I will speak about today. So at the center of the book is Dima, a Palestinian woman whose life has been shaped by statelessness, displacement, and constrained mobility. But as our conversations unfolded, it became impossible to tell her story in isolation. Again and again, fragments of my own family history surfaced alongside hers. Jewish family shaped by exile, migration, and the long aftermath of the Holocaust. The narrative, therefore, moves between two different historical worlds: a Palestinian Muslim life shaped by the legacy of the Nakba, and a Jewish Israeli life shaped by the memory of the Holocaust, Zionist education, and the afterlives of European anti-Semitism. And these histories are not identical and cannot be equated, but placing them side by side brings into view both moments of resonance and deep structural differences in legal status, mobility, political power, and also the possibilities of belonging. And as a writer, I was interested in how these histories became visible not only through political analysis, but within the intimate space of conversation between two women. What began as language instruction gradually became an exchange of memories, family histories, and political experiences. Seen in this light, the book belongs very much to the work celebrated in this seminar series. It is very much about how women's voices carry history across generations, across languages, across borders, and sometimes across deep political divides. It is also a book about the conditions under which certain stories can and cannot be told. It asks what happens when a life shaped by trauma, exile, and displacement becomes difficult to write down, and what it means for another person to become the listener, interlocutor, and eventually the writer of that story. So the talk I want to give today is therefore not only about the content of the book, but also about its form, its method, and its ethical stakes. It explores family memory, inherited trauma, oral testimony, and the relationship between a Jewish woman and a Palestinian woman whose lives might seem to belong to separate histories, but whose stories, once brought into conversation, illuminate one another in unexpected ways. Now, before turning to Dima's story directly, I want to begin with a photograph from my own family history, not because my story stands at the center of the book. I think it does not, but because this narrative emerged from the meeting of two different historical inheritances: Jewish exile in 20th century Europe and Palestinian displacement in the Middle East of the 20th and 21st centuries. And these distinct historical trajectories form the background against which our friendship, ultimately this book, became possible. So this photograph shows my parents with my older sister, was taken in Belgium in the early 1960s when they were living there as refugees from communist Romania. My father had survived Auschwitz. Nearly all of the extended family who had been deported during the Holocaust did not survive. And although Dima is the central figure of the book, our conversations repeatedly brought our family histories into view. The strongest connection between us is, of course, Israel-Palestine. But interestingly, neither of us was born there. Dima was born in Jordan and only later moved to Gaza, and I was born in Germany and only later moved to Israel. Yet for both of us, that geographical space became very central to identity and historical consciousness. Our trajectories, however, were profoundly different. Dima's family originally came from Palestine, were displaced to Gaza in 1948 and later to Jordan after 1967. I grew up in Germany and eventually became an Israeli citizen, so our lives are marked by two different historical inheritances: the Holocaust in my family's history and the Nakba in hers. These events are profoundly different, yet they remain historically entangled, shaping the moral vocabulary through which we approach one another's stories, and also the silences that sometimes surround them. So for me, this photograph also represents the way history travels through families, often through the voices of women. Much of what my sister and I learned about our father's past came through fragments preserved by the women in our family. Some of these resurfaced only recently in letters that have become part of the fragile archive through which we try to understand our past. For many years, my sister and I wanted to write these stories down. Our father was never able to do so, and we too found the task nearly impossible. Scholars of testimony have often observed that traumatic experience resists narration. Marianne Hirsch, who spoke here last year, has described this intergenerational transmission as host memory. the way traumatic histories shape the identities of those who did not directly experience them. So when I met Dima during the early months of the COVID pandemic, spring 2020, I heard a similar difficulty in her voice. She told me that she had tried many times to write her story, but found herself unable to continue. Whenever she set out to put the memories on paper, she said they closed in on her. The book that grew out of our extended conversations is therefore not only about exile and displacement, it is also about the difficulty and sometimes the necessity of writing lives shaped by history. We now move further back in time, though we remain in the same country, Belgium, where the narrative of the book itself begins. So this photograph shows a school class at the Lycée de Jeunes Filles in Brussels in 1939. It is an all-girls class, but it is not a Jewish school. Most of the students in the photographs were not Jewish. At first glance, it appears to be an entirely ordinary image, a group of schoolgirls attending classes, forming friendships, and imagining their futures on the eve of the Second World War. By the late 1930s, Belgium had become a place of refuge for Jewish families fleeing Nazi Germany after 1933. Among these girls were also daughters of exile, though nothing in the image itself reveals that difference. Only historical insight makes it visible. Photographs like this capture moments that appear stable and ordinary, yet later become records of fragile worlds on the verge of transformation. One of the girls in this photograph is my husband's mother, Suzanne. Her family had left Germany in 1933, the year Hitler came to power. Like many Jewish families who left Germany during these early years of Nazi rule, they did not initially understand themselves as refugees and believed their departure might be temporary. But the safety that exile seemed to promise proved fragile. In May 1940, Germany invaded Belgium, and families who had already fled once were forced to flee again. Placed next to the earlier photograph of my own parents, this image reveals two very different trajectories of Jewish exile in the 20th century. One begins with early flight from Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and the other belongs to the post-war world of Holocaust survival, Cold War migration, and also eventual resettlement. And then, decades later, Belgium appears again in a very different historical context when Dima seeks asylum there. And we're looking here at a detention center in Belgium where Dima was held, which is really the starting point of the book's narrative. Belgium emerges as a recurrent site of exile in the book, a place where different histories of displacement intersect across generations and political contexts. Now let me read to you from the opening passage from the first chapter, very beginning, which is called From Amman and Gaza to Brussels. As usual, she didn't answer my call right away, but she sent a text letting me know that she was busy in the kitchen, and she reached me after she and her fellow inmates had finished dinner. Her situation was grim, but I could sense over the line, me in Providence, Rhode Island, Dima in a lockup for illegal immigrants in Bruges, Belgium, her effort to control her voice and emotions. She was happy I called, she said, but there was nothing good to report. There was the usual daily routine from time to time, a change of guards or movement of convicts. Some of them had more difficult stories than others. A few seemed friendly, but then turned depressed and unpleasant. Most were kind and sensitive, but tired of being locked up, not knowing what the future would bring. Dima spoke in her usual tone, mixing kindness with humor, but also hopelessness, telling me about one really lunatic woman who had come to the detention center that day. The woman was a mother of 5, each child from a different father, none of whom appeared to be in the picture. A sex worker who it turned out later had good lawyers. She did nothing but scream and utter gibberish. Once she rolled on the cold concrete floor, holding on to some documents. The inmates were scared of her, and so were the guards, who seemed to know her from previous visits. The eccentric woman was released from the center 4 hours after she arrived. But her screams, her suffering and misfortune continued to resonate long after her awkward presence. Why was it, Dima had to wonder, that she, whose entire life had been shaped by virtue, modesty, and piety, remained under arrest in the detention center, while a deranged person acting out was allowed to leave? I feel my entire life is upside down, she told me. When strange things would happen to me in Jordan or Gaza, I could somehow understand. I understood the context. I knew how to read and recognize the codes. Here, since I'm imprisoned, I've lost all my usual references and nothing makes sense anymore. I realize that my values don't count here. People have different beliefs, different traditions. This poor woman, her crazy behavior, and how then she's gifted with being released so quickly is so confusing to me, Kati. I'm surrounded by so many strange people and so many weird things. And some of what is shocking to me seems to be normal to others, but perhaps it's just the fact of losing my freedom that makes me think the world, my world, has lost its sense. I was happy to hear Dima's voice, despite her distress. It was almost as if I had called her to reassure me. I'd never been to Gaza myself. My only knowledge of the CIB, the Centre pour les Beaux de Bruges, came from my conversations with Dima and a website containing only the directions to their facility and the capacity for women detainees held within its confines. I knew, as Dima did, the gamble she had taken in going to Belgium could end badly. And I didn't want to burden her with my fears. So what should I say? I couldn't give her my news, tell her about my travels to southern France, my dinner parties with friends, my son's wedding plans, and my upcoming trip to Israel, Palestine. How could that cheer her up? It would only make her more aware of her misery. I was free and mobile. Dima was under arrest, and no one knew for how long. And no one could predict whether in the next minute she'd be told she was being deported back to Gaza or Jordan. I tried to imagine Dima's beautiful face framed by a black or brown or blue hijab, with her large dark eyes and her expression exuding nothing but kindness. She had always looked so proper, so appealing, so put together. I wondered what living in jail had done to her appearance. It was just a couple weeks after her 28th birthday. She was beyond the average age when a Palestinian woman from a traditional background is supposed to be married and have children. True, she was married, but only on paper and according to a document written by a sheikh the Belgium refused to recognize. But she had never been physically intimate with her husband, despite their now 7-year-long relationship. The CIB had opened in 1995 in the buildings of the former prison for women previously known as the Refuge, located on the fringes of Bruges, which for most people, including people like me, is a kind of fairy tale medieval town. Nothing of the CIV, of course, seemed fairy tale-like to Dima, even though she had achieved one of her longtime goals, or a dream of sorts. She finally was in the same country as Amir, the man she had fallen in love with when she lived in Gaza. But she was an illegal entity in Belgium, a number. She was E2, a refugee without a name or a home, caged with other women, each of whom had her own story of despair. So this opening passage very much frames the profound asymmetry between our lives. Dima was speaking from a detention center, while her legal status remained totally uncertain. And I was speaking from the safety of my home with the mobility and protection that come with citizenship. Now, the political theorist Hannah Arendt, who herself lived for many years as a stateless refugee, once described statelessness as the loss of what you call the right to have rights. Now, let me take us to the place that forms the geographical center of the story of the Middle East, more specifically Israel, Palestine, and Gaza. So, as you heard, I met Dima during the early months of the COVID pandemic, and our meeting took place online, and she first appeared on my screen as my Arabic instructor. And what began as practical language instruction gradually turned into conversations about our families, our pasts, and the different circumstances that have shaped our lives. As I mentioned earlier, Dima's family originally came from what is now Israel and was displaced first to Gaza and later to Jordan. My own path to Israel unfolded very differently. I grew up in Germany, and like many Jews of my generation, I was raised with the idea of Israel as a place of refuge and belonging. And so in my early 20s, I eventually made Aliyah. I migrated to Israel, became a citizen. And in a certain sense, both Dima and I began life at some distance from the place that later became central to our identities, but under profoundly different conditions. In my case, my family did not come from the region, and the absence of citizenship was temporary and resolved within one generation. In Dima's case, her family was originally from Palestine, and statelessness has remained a continuing condition across several generations. And it was really within this space of both resonance and asymmetry that our conversations unfolded. One of the stories Dima told me early on concerned the moment when she first came to Gaza to begin her university studies. So let me read a short passage describing her arrival there. Her other, more feasible option was to study in Gaza, where she could stay with members of her extended family. She had at least a couple of options to choose from. There were her uncles Jamal Abu Haytham and Salah Abu Musa, her mother's brothers, who lived with their respective families in a building they shared in Jabalia camp. This was the very house Dima's mother, Lubna, had grown up in. The other possibility was living with Uncle Mahmoud Abu Isam and his family in Beit Lahia, a city north of Jabalia, also within the North Gaza Governorate. And so Gaza it would be. Dima's parents made quick arrangements for her move there. This was in 2011. It would be the first time that Dima would live far from her immediate family, but she was enchanted nonetheless, not because she wanted to be away from her parents and siblings, but because going to Gaza in a way meant a kind of going home. Gaza was, after all, the place where her parents were from, even if displaced from the former, more permanent home in what is now Israel. I remember my excitement, Dima told me. I was going to discover a new world. It was my first experience of independence, or at least so I thought. And growing up in a country that is not really your home, where you are an outsider, not quite worthy of the others, of those who are given the gift of citizenship, I felt like I was given this privilege of returning to a place that I could really claim as my home, the home of my parents, the place we came from, Palestine. Clutching a suitcase containing all her worldly possessions, saying goodbye to her parents who came with her to the Queen Alia airport in Amman, wearing her gray jeans, a black blouse, and a black and white hijab, Dima flew to Cairo, the first airplane ride of her life. The hour-and-a-half flight went by quickly. It was a short and sweet taste of living in the clouds, both in a real and in a metaphoric sense. Little did I know what was waiting for me in my new life. Her cousin Ali met her at Cairo International Airport and rode with her in a Sayalit Ujra, a cab, the 200 and something miles north to Rafah, the sole legal crossing point between Egypt and Gaza. By the time they got there, it was 7:30 p.m., so they spent the night at a hotel in El Arish, the largest city on the Sinai Peninsula. Sitting behind Ali and the driver, Dima watched the rugged landscape with wonder. As they drove to Rafah in Syria, the Egyptian part of Rafah, the next morning, the hot desert bareness ultimately gave way to a road flanked by tall trees. And when they reached the border, they found a chaotic scene. Since Ali would not enter Gaza with Dima, the border officials allowed her, as a young woman traveling by herself, to cross ahead of the people standing in long lines. For now, Providence continued to move in her favor. So after hearing that passage, the photograph on the slide becomes easier to understand. This image was taken by one of Dima's cousins who teaches gymnastics and acrobatics to children in Gaza. It shows one of the students practicing in the narrow alleyway just outside the house where Dima lived with her relatives during the year she studied at the university. So what you're looking at here is not just a random street scene. It is part of the very environment in which Dima lived during her time in Gaza. For me, this photograph became one of the very few visual anchors I have for a place that I know primarily through Dima's voice. As an Israeli citizen, I was never allowed to enter Gaza as a civilian. And before meeting Dima, most of what I knew about Gaza came through news images, political debates, and academic writing. But through hundreds of hours of conversation with her, that understanding began to change. And so gradually through our conversations, I began to construct sort of a mental geography of Gaza shaped by memory and lived experience rather than maps or statistics. And what I was trying to grasp through Dima's testimony closely resembles what the oral historian Alessandro Portelli has described. Portelli argues that oral testimony does not simply transmit factual information about the past. It also conveys meanings, emotions, and the textures of lived experience. What testimony offers, in other words, is not only what happened, but how it was lived and remembered. Through Dima's voice, Gaza gradually became imaginable to me, not only as a political space, but as a lived environment, place of daily routines, relationships, of ordinary life. The alleyway you see here is part of that world, and is also a world that has now, in large measure, disappeared. But before turning to the more recent destruction of that world, it is important to understand the conditions under which Dima came to live in Gaza. Before the current war, about 2.2 million people lived in the Gaza Strip, most of them refugees or descendants of refugees from 1948. And these conditions produced a dense urban environment with narrow streets and very limited public space. So Dima's decision to move to Gaza in 2011 was shaped in part by the legal status of Palestinians of Gazan origin living in Jordan. Because they do not hold Jordanian citizenship, access to Jordanian public universities can be both financially and administratively difficult. Now, education occupies a very central place in Palestinian social life, particularly among refugee families, as one of the few forms of capital that can actually travel across borders and generations. I still remember my grandmother, who survived Auschwitz, telling me, you can lose everything, your home, your belongings, your loved ones, but no one can ever take away your education. So for Dima's parents, sending her to Gaza to study, therefore, had both practical and symbolic meaning. It was economically feasible and offered access to higher education. But it was also, in a certain sense, a return to a place that remained part of the family's historical geography. The book itself ends before the events of October 7. When I finished writing the manuscript, the narrative concluded with Dima's story as she had told it to me. The years of displacement, the time she spent studying in Gaza, her attempts to build a life under conditions of legal uncertainty and restricted mobility. But once the war began, it became impossible to leave the story there. I realized that I needed to add a short postscript written under very different historical circumstances. And this image comes from a newspaper report showing the destruction surrounding Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City in 2024. Al-Shifa was located in the part of Gaza where Dima spent much of her time when she lived there. Her cousin Amia worked there as a pharmacist. Now, before the war, Al-Shifa was the largest hospital complex in Gaza and one of the central medical institutions in the territory. The destruction you see in this photograph represents not only damaged buildings, but the collapse of an entire civic infrastructure, hospitals, universities, schools, neighborhoods, and homes. So the Gaza that appears in the story I'm telling in large measure is a world that no longer exists. Now, Dima has remained, of course, in close contact with her family in Gaza throughout this period, and through her, I've actually also been in touch with them on a regular basis. So while Gaza remains physically inaccessible to me, the events unfolding there are not something distant that I encounter only through news reports. They've become part of a world that Dima and I, very different ways, now share. And that realization raises a difficult question for anyone engaged in life writing. What happens to the narrative when the physical world it describes disappears. Most of the places Dima described have been destroyed, but through narrative, they continue to exist as remembered worlds. The postscript therefore becomes both a reflection on the war and a meditation on the fragility of lived environments, raising a final question that I want to raise, which is, what does it mean to write about a place that is disappearing or has already disappeared? But there's another question. Why did I write this book and not Dima? And we discussed that question many times before I began writing. I would never have written the book without her explicit consent, and more than consent, without her encouragement. Dima had made repeated attempts to write her story, but each time the process became overwhelming and she had to stop. And yet she also told me something else. She said that she wanted her story to exist in written form, but she wanted a trace of it to remain. So we made a decision together. The book that eventually took shape is the result of many sustained conversations between us. Dima read every chapter of the manuscript. She corrected details, clarified memories, and improved the final text. But even with that close collaboration, the question of voice remains. In many ways, this is a story about a Palestinian woman, Muslim refugee whose life has been shaped by statelessness, displacement, and restricted mobility. Yet the story is told through the voice of a Jewish woman. For many Jews of my generation, the inheritance of past traumas, extermination, and exile very much shaped our relationship to Israel as a place imagined as refuge and historical repair. Only later, when I actually lived and worked and raised children in Israel, did I begin to confront another reality. That the creation and consolidation of that refuge also produced displacement and loss for others. Edward Said once described Palestinians as the refugees of the refugees, pointing to how one history of displacement can emerge from another. These histories are not the same, but they are historically intertwined. Writing this book, therefore, meant confronting that entanglement directly. It meant asking what it means for a Jewish Israeli woman to listen to and narrate the life of Palestinian refugees, whose history is bound up with the same historical transformations that shape my own identity. The book does not claim to speak for Palestinians. It speaks from with an ongoing exchange marked by trust, disagreement, shared vulnerability, and the recognition that our histories remain deeply connected, even when they unfold under profoundly unequal political conditions. This is also where the connection to life writing becomes especially important. Life writing is not only about recording individual lives, but also about the ethical act of listening. My hope is simply that the book allows readers to encounter one Palestinian life, not as an abstraction or political symbol, but as a human presence. Because sometimes the only way certain stories can be told at all is across the very divides that history has produced. Through fragile encounters between people, between memories, and between histories that reveal how deeply our lives are entangled with the lives of others. Thank you so much.
And it's good not Katharina. I'm sure everybody has listened with great interest to such an extraordinary story and so to such an extraordinary story and so well told. I've read the book, but every time I hear Katharina speak about it, I'm fascinated again and again because there's so many different aspects to the story between two women from such different worlds. So here we are. Have any of you got any questions that you would like to ask? Fantastic.
Very moved by what you said about your grandmother and saying that, you know, education is the one thing that can't be taken away. Could you tell me a little bit more about your grandmother?
Hear what she said.
If I could say a little more about my grandmother, she was she was born in Transylvania, Romania, today Romania, and went. There was a numerous clauses for Jews at the time, and she was very determined to study to university, and so she moved to Czechoslovakia, where she was the only woman who graduated in chemical engineering. She lost her daughter Agnes in Auschwitz and her husband, but her son, my father, survived. And they found each other after the war, and she was a very strong woman, but I think very much shaped by what she had experienced. One year in Auschwitz of torture and loss is not something that you can forget. And I think, I mean, I was very close both to my father and my grandmother and many others who were there. And so it has very much shaped my understanding, not only of Judaism, but also of Jews' relationship to Israel, and has very much determined my decision to migrate to Israel to become a citizen. But I was very disheartened to learn how Jews, mindful of their own history, can treat another people based on ethnic and religious difference. And this is something I feel very committed to and I think any Jew who's committed to their history and aware of what happened and what is happening now, I think we have to speak up, because too many individuals claimed during the Second World War that they didn't know, or they felt powerless against a huge machinery of cruelty. And I think every single person who knows, who has the ability to hear and read and speak, has to speak up and never be passive, and never say I'm nobody. My word doesn't count. I swifted a little bit away from my grandmother's, from the story of my grandmother, but she's been a very significant person in my early years.
I'd like to add, to point out rather, that both Dima, who was born in Jordan and lived and studied in Gaza, landed up with her husband in Belgium, whereas Katharina was born of Romanian survivor parents in Germany, emigrated to Israel, and has become a professor in America. Just the sheer fact that we have all these countries, these two people moving around 5, 6, 7 different countries. So in other words, nobody, although you have American citizenship now,
As of last year,
After how many years?
30.
After 30 years. And what about Dima? Does she just have permanent residence in Belgium?
It would be a spoiler. She's still a refugee. She was recognized as refugee, which was a huge struggle. And the
And
whole
that
book
is-
is about the struggle, how to become a recognized refugee.
Yeah. So I think that is another aspect of, it's not only about the Holocaust and Nakba, but how it continues over generations to different countries and different their children, what happens to your children, and where they are, and where I assume Dima has a child, and where that child is. So just as a continuation from your grandmother, I was trying to trace the steps from the grandmother over time and place. Anyone else?
Just, Vera, just a tiny little correction. I was not born in Belgium. I was born in Germany. Yes, you said Belgium, but that's perfectly fine because there was a baby. That was my older sister. She was born in Belgium, and her name is also Agnes Agi, the name of my aunt, the daughter of my grandmother.
Because I lived in Germany many years.
Right.
And I come from the same part of the world in Transylvania. Only I landed up in England and you ended up in America. But anyway, that's enough. It's a different story. A different book and a different story.
Katharina and your host, thank you so much for an incredibly moving story that you've shared with us. Will you excuse, please, a quite personal question if it comes across?
This is very personal.
Yes.
So
If it comes across in an insensitive way, just to contextualize, perhaps. I'm drawn to your story. I'm a retired German scholar, so I'm picking up this story, of course, the Holocaust. I'm familiar with Hannah Arendt and so forth, but you've left Germany. You left Germany and settled in Israel. You've now shared with us that you've become an American citizen. Can I just ask you then, have you become a refugee from Israel, or is your relationship to Israel a different one? Could you share something about that identity of someone who has, do you have dual citizenship with Israel and America?
so I was born stateless.
Yes.
In Germany. My parents were refugees from Eastern Europe after the war in the 60s. So, but very early, and I only quite recently discovered that history wasn't something that shaped my identity in very important ways. The refugee status I had when I was born. There were other things that shaped my identity and my memories, but that was not important. But it became important when I tried to understand Jewish refugee statuses after the Second World War and the relation to the creation of the State of Israel and the Palestinian refugee situation. I mean, this whole entanglement and this is when I dug up the exact date of when I became a citizen. So I was first a German citizen and grew up in a very strong, I received a very strong Jewish and Zionist education in the Jewish community in Germany at the time. I mean, both through my parents' identity and their own traditions at home, and but also at the synagogue and the Jewish community. There was, I mean, the Zionist movement was extremely active, and so I was told, I mean, I felt very much that Germany was not my home. There was a lot of anti-Semitism still. And I mean, the stories at home, I was always the only Jew in school and always pointed out, oh, she's the Israelite. And so my sister made Aliyah. She became a citizen after high school, after finishing high school in Germany. And I did the same. I followed my sister's footsteps. But in my case, it was a little bit more complicated, right? Because I studied in France, but
I mean, whenever there was semester break and whenever I did research, I would go to Israel. So since I'm a teenager, I've spent lots of time in Israel before actually becoming a citizen at the age of 21 and then moving there at age 25. And this is where 3 of my children grew up, between the US and Israel. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I think so. May I just ask you, and I apologize if I'm leading us down a rabbit hole, but was your refuge in Germany, in Eastern Germany, or was it in West Germany? Because I'm a scholar of East Germany.
Okay,
So I have this idea.
No, of
you know,
course,
there are
yes,
histories of
yes.
So,
Yes.
no, West Germany.
West Germany.
West Germany, yes. But I have lived in the East and quite recently in Berlin, and so I'm also very interested in the dynamic and complications and different layers of complexity.
Yes.
Germany.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to read your book. By hook or by crook. You said it sounded like it was hard to get a hold of, but I'm sure I'll manage. I come from the US, and so I'm very aware, I work on a campus, and I'm wondering if you feel like things are being projected onto your story, your and Dima's story, because once it's out of your hands, the people have now politicized every single aspect of whatever you're saying, most likely. And have you had to push against that, or have you had people interpreting it in ways that you did not mean it to be understood?
That's a great question, and I should start with my editors. The process of approaching different presses in the US, and there was a lot of hesitation. Some didn't like the word Gaza, others didn't like the fact that I wrote the book that I, as a Jewish Israeli woman, writing a book about a Palestinian. I mean, everybody had a different suggestion, and it was, I mean, yeah, I have a couple, the two literary agents that represent me are a couple, and they had 2 different opinions. So everybody who came into the picture had a different opinion of what should be written and how it should be written. And at the end, Dima, it's actually a pseudonym. It's not her real name, to protect her and her family, who are still in Gaza and Jordan mostly, but also to protect them in Belgium. So now I lost j'ai perdu le fil. Oh yeah, everybody had a different opinion, and then finally there was a publisher who agreed to the way Dima and I wanted to present the story. And it's not the greatest publisher, I must admit, Potomac Books of University of Nebraska Press. I had an incredible offer from a very, very distinguished publisher who said, this is great, but we really want you, first of all, to call it differently. I mean, to a different title, Under the Shadow of the Holocaust, and put you at the center and your trauma in the middle of it, and really reduce the story of Dima. And I felt, I mean, I just have to do what feels right to Dima and to me. And so the decision we took is that I will tell her story from my perspective and also take responsibility, writing from the perspective of a Jewish Israeli woman. And so in terms of how it was received, and if there is political resonance, and of course, and I can tell you that other than the scholar who reviewed my book, who's actually an Israeli scholar of Israel studies, the director of the Center for Israel Studies at NYU, She was my first anonymous reviewer, but then she came forth and because she loved the book and she invited me to give a lecture at the Center for Israel Studies at NYU. But this is the only university in the US who gave me a platform. And I had many invitations in the UK and Europe. So the landscape here is very, very different. And currently, even the most left, I'm still a lot also professionally in Israel, and even the most left-wing spaces cannot accept a narrative that has at its focus the personal story of a Palestinian refugee from Gaza. It's currently really not possible. So yes, the reactions are very different. I mean, there are bookstores and clubs that have invited me in the US. Bookstores and clubs, not universities. Universities, I mean, there's real censorship now. I mean, yeah, on various themes. I mean, Israel, working on Israel-Palestine is not a good. I mean, you don't want to be in the US right now. Queer studies is not so great either. I mean, there are certain fields that
We
are.
can put that down to the current government.
Of course, yes, and yes, the government
Yes.
and the fact also the university system, frankly, that depends on donations and donors' pressures and the fact that the large private universities, the most important universities in the US are privately funded, most of them, and so that private funding also comes with obligations to donors, important donors who sometimes very easily, I mean, very clearly and openly dictate what can and what cannot be taught and said on university campuses.
Can you say a few words how people can get hold of your book?
I suppose online through Amazon. I don't like to advertise Amazon at all, but yes, I mean, it should be very easy through the press. I mean, Katharina Galor.
I could ask my library.
Yes, that's also a possibility. It is coming out in French this month. It is being published in Belgium, and it should be easier to get a hold of from Belgium, but it will be a French version. But I assume, I mean, that you can order simply online, but it takes a little longer. Yeah.
But it might have changed.
Yes.
Just to say that it's available as an ebook through your press.
Oh.
And if you'd like to,
Okay.
and if you share the details of the publication and where people get it, I will make sure that all attendees receive it.
Okay, thank you.
It's Nebraska University Press. Nebraska University Press. So via there. Anyone else? Or question? You're all looking very thoughtful, so.
Yeah, I'm very curious why you're here. Why would you come to talk like this? I actually yesterday gave a different talk on the same book at St. Anthony's College, the Center for Middle East Studies, and it was a very different audience. I mean, I could tell, and it was also a relatively intimate group, and so I was very curious. There was actually a Palestinian scholar speaking at the same time. And I know that for some, I mean, having a Jewish woman tell the story of a Palestinian refugee is not very appealing. And so I was very curious why people would come to a talk. And also there's a lot of sensitivity bringing the histories of the Holocaust into dialogue with the histories of the Nakba, and that can be putting off to some. So I'm just curious, why are you here? I shouldn't ask this question. I mean, I should just be happy that you are here.
To be honest, I think, hello, first of all, my name is Bilal from Munich in Germany. I think it makes it even more interesting that a Jewish woman is talking about Palestine. I don't think there's a contradiction, to be honest. It makes it even more interesting because conversation, I think that's what we all should look for in future. So if we go into conversations, not just to hear like different voices or even similar voices, sometimes I don't think it's a contradiction. So I think, and I think a lot of people would think something similar. It makes it even, I personally, when I heard about this book a couple of days ago, of course, I Googled the name, author, and what it is about generally, and the way how it was articulated online made it even more interesting, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And personally, why I'm interested in the book, I think the topic of identity is something that is interesting for a lot of people, including me, as someone from Germany, but born in Germany, but owned ethnically from another region of the world, also having like Muslim father, but a Christian mom, and it's very interesting, in my opinion, looking at it right now after 29 years. And that's why I think the topic of identity is something that I'm interested a lot, and that's why I also wanted to ask, but I wasn't sure if I should ask the question, but considering that you lived in a lot of different countries with different experiences, I would love to hear how would you nowadays, with all these experiences, how would you identify yourself now? Is it a question I could ask?
Absolutely, yes, of course, it's at the core of the book, and but it's a very complicated question that I ask myself very regularly, and this is one of the questions we've discussed. Where do we feel home? And yeah, and it's I think once you've lived in more than one place, you become torn. And it doesn't, it's not that it's not something you can resolve. And having lived in a place is not something you can eradicate. I tried, actually, after I left Germany, I associated it with my family's trauma and being an outsider. And so for decades, I refused to speak the language and to interact with Germans anywhere I went for more than 40 years. And then I met my husband, who's sitting here, whose family originally escaped from Germany in the 1930s. And they didn't go, they went through a very traumatic experience of migration and exile, but it was not the experience of death and torture in the death camps. And I think it is, and he always had a very different relationship through Germany, and actually became a scholar of Germany and German Jewry, and had a totally different perspective on Germany. And I rediscovered Germany through his eyes decades later, and actually became very fond and very connected and fond of Germany for complicated reasons. So I tried to push Germany away, but I wrote a book about Israelis and Palestinians living in Berlin, actually, with a Palestinian co-author. And then I have a very complicated relationship to France, which also, I always try to believe I was French because I was exposed to French. That was one of my other mishugas of my grandmother, that we had to leave. We had to speak many languages because we would never know where we would end up. So I was exposed to French starting from the age of 5, and then studied for 6 years in France, and we have a home there. So I'm very connected to France, but I'm also an outsider, of course. In the US, I went there 30 years ago, have spent about 50% of that time outside of America. And as I always tell my husband, the only reason I was actually willing and at some point even eager to get American citizenship is so that I could spend more time outside of America and not being harassed. I don't feel at home there, but I happen to have an American husband and kids who are connected to America and a job there also. And Israel is probably the most complicated relationship because my heart is there. I feel it's the only country when I go there, I feel at home, but I don't agree with the politics. I don't agree with the apartheid system, with the genocide, with segregation, with apartheid, with the system, and with the brainwashing that, I mean, that happens in the street, on media platforms, in schools, in museums, everywhere. That really, the demonstrations are not in support of the Palestinians. The demonstrations against the government, but not because of what happens in Gaza or the West Bank.
At least against the government that has these policies that against Gaza or Palestinians.
The demonstrations are mostly about the reform of the judicial system, and the judicial system is actually a machinery of the occupation, which, I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but I rely on Israeli scholars, Jewish Israeli scholar Michael Spark, for example, who has written many books on the topic. And so about 80% of Israelis feel the pain of their suffering and of being living under threat, of being surrounded by Arab countries that are enemies. And it is a horrible situation to be in, to be hated by all of your neighbors. But it is the only perspective that most Israelis know. They are the victims, and they don't see that. I mean, for them, their army, and this is what they're being taught and told, that their army is the most humane army in the world. But it is also one of the most powerful, and no matter how humane this army is, it has killed more than 70,000 Palestinians in Gaza in a very short period of time. It has disintegrated whole infrastructure, not to speak of all the children who died. I mean, tens of thousands of children, and children who are injured and maimed, and orphans, and yes, a very humane army indeed. But so I do feel with the pain of Jewish Israelis, because I did not disconnect. I still, my heart is there, and I spend a lot of time there, and I as part of my research, I feel obligated also to interact with scholars there, with people in Israel, but also in the West Bank, with Palestinians. I am watching the news and reading the Israeli news on a daily basis. I do want to know, why is it that Israelis feel and think the way they think, and why is their perspective so very, 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 very different from European perspectives? I mean, also within Europe, there's of course differences, but
At this point, as you mentioned Europe, I think the story gets even more complicated, because as a diaspora Jew who has not lived in Israel, well, we lived in Israel for a year and came back disappointed after 1 year. For me, in theory, Israel is the Jewish homeland, but I don't feel at home in Israel at all. First of all, I don't speak Hebrew. I'm not part of the large Sephardic community. As an Ashkenazi Jew, Israel feels very Middle Eastern. So I live as a European, Romanian, Hungarian Jew in London, which also is not my home. So the question gets more complicated. Each individual Jewish person, in this case woman, has another story. Not all Jewish people, as you've heard probably in the last 3 or 4 weeks, what's happened in England, identifies with Israel, although I go regularly and I have family there, but I'm less at home in Israel than I'm in England, and I'm not at home in England, as you can hear from my accent. So it's a complicated story all around.
I come from a background, an Irish background, and my mother lived through the Second World War, so I have memories of her telling me stories, and she still says to this day that religion is the root of a lot of evil. And she also reminded me that after the Second World War, Jews were not welcome in Europe. So I don't forget that. But religion has caused a huge amount of trouble in the north of Ireland. I'm sure you know an awful lot about it. And my parents were atheists because they both felt that religion was not something they wanted their children to be forced to adopt, if that makes any sense. How do you personally feel about religion? Do you think this book transcends religion or understands religion? Or are religious beliefs merely semiotics of culture and nationhood?
So I mean, there is, first of all, my academic interest and curiosity about Judaism, and became completely central to my life, to my identity, to my scholarship. It's been a real obsession to figure out what it means for me and for others to be a Jew, to be Jewish. And I think it was very much because I knew that my family had to die because they were Jewish. Most of my family and those who survived were severely handicapped mentally and physically. And so I had to make sense out of it. And so since I'm little, I had this obsession, what does it mean to be Jewish? And I went through many different phases. My parents were sort of secular, but still, I mean, they celebrated all the Jewish holidays and went to the synagogue, and my father taught me how to pray my evening prayers at night. And it was traditionally very dominant. And I belonged to the synagogue and I learned about it. And even as a young child, I wanted to learn more than others. And I remember having private lesson with the rabbi and integrating it into my high school curriculum, and then it became my scholarship was totally, and I studied for a year in an Orthodox Zionist yeshiva in Jerusalem. And so it's an obsession, and I will never tired of it. It's because this desire to eradicate Jews as a group that I'm so obsessed with it. Today I'm not religious, but I am very committed to my Jewish identity because I don't see any reason to exchange it with a different identity. But it's also a cultural identity, and it's about history for me. And Dima is actually very pious, and I think a very pious Muslim. And I think part of our attraction is that that religion plays a very important role in our lives. For her, as a lived experience, for me, mostly by now, an intellectual activity and obsession. And I'm very interested in the dialogue between Judaism and Christianity throughout the centuries, and the dialogue between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's also part of my scholarship. And so I was very interested not only in Dima's Palestinian identity, but also I'm very, very fascinated by the relationship between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament and the Quran. And so I had many questions for Dima. And she was extremely curious about Judaism and my Jewish identity and Jewish history. And so
I mean, so we had lots of conversations about religion, and I don't agree that religion is the evil of all causes. I have lots of, I'm not religious, but I have lots of appreciation and respect and even love for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I mean, both religion, all three religions have played a very important role in my life, and studying churches and medieval Christianity have been a very strong presence in my academic life, and Islam has been a very important presence in my academic life. And so I think all religions can produce evil, and they're extremists in all religious groups, fanatics.
But it's just growing up in the shadow of the Catholic and Protestant conflict really turned my parents against organized religion. Not the
Yes,
not
yeah.
beliefs, but just that idea that one group would want to annihilate the other. So,
I completely understand, yes.
This book, you're transcending maybe some of the canons of the two religions.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I like the way you put it, absolutely. I think there are quite a few conversations I write about in the book about religion and how we shared Jewish traditions. And I mean, Dina wanted to hear about my Jewish traditions, and I wanted to know about her Muslim. And I mean, there are lots of conversations like this, and more often than not, we were actually surprised and shocked how similar some of the traditions are.
Thank you.
Thank you for this, for your comments and
I
questions.
think we have 1 minute left. If anyone wants to squeeze in one question. Larry wants to squeeze in one question. I'll say something.
I'll say it very quickly.
Sorry. So I was just wondering, given your background and the topic of this, which is partially friendship and ethics, to what degree were you influenced by scholars who've written on friendship ethics, some of which famously are from Jewish backgrounds?
Well, I must say maybe the scholar who influenced me most is Sayeda Cham, my Palestinian co-author, who grew up partially, whose family is partially Muslim and Christian. He himself is a devoted Quaker. We've written together for 10 years. I think he's the scholar they are the scholar who most influenced my writing and not only my writing, my way of thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. No, they live in Swarthmore in the US and will be in Oxford all of next academic year. So.
Thank you so much. Would you like to wrap up? Okay.
I'll come up here, so thank you so much for coming today, and thank you so much to this wonderful pairing that we had in front of us. Just to say again that we will, if you'd like to donate to support our work, we'll be standing here for a little bit. We can have a chat with us about the work we do here at Occlu. Katharina and Vera will be in the Wilson Cafe. If you'd like to join for a little post-seminar chat about Katharina's work, please feel free to. So again, thank you so much for coming, and please join us at our future seminars. Very much.